Hello, good afternoon or good evening, actually, and across the globe. Warm welcome to our award-winning building, Makery Building on Broadway, Auckland. First and foremost, let's get through the health and safety issues first. Now, in the unlikely event that we have to evacuate, I'll say simply follow any of the macro people or follow myself. But the general rule is please avoid the lift, would orderly descend through the stairways and we'll gather at the park next to the Freedom Olympic swimming pool. Now, to use the gent to relieve yourselves, the gents and the ladies are to my right here, or beckon to any of the Mercury people. They would take you, point in the right direction. So again, warm welcome. Now let's get through the general flow of how things are going to look this evening. We are going to walk through the static view of risk and draw some insights. We would also look through dynamic view of risk and draw additional insight. And time permitting, we will go through rate of change. By the way, Chris is going to send you some detailed notes at the end of today. Now, we operate in an environment of uncertainties. Businesses are set out to sanitize the environment to create a sense of certainty amid uncertainties. Let's take, for instance, Mercury is an energy company. When you get to your homes this evening, you want to be able to turn on your switch and light should come on. However, we know that in generating power, we use our hydraulics. Those could be dry, those could be full of water. So we manage uncertainties to provide you certainty. So a business is a risky venture requiring strategic risk management to create value. Therefore, optimizing risk dynamics should be a primary focus of strategic enablers. And technology these days drive, and in some cases, is the business. Hence, optimized technology risk dynamics must necessarily be a critical success factor for any business going concern. So if you cannot manage technology risk, likelihood that you won't be able to manage strategic risk to drive and deliver value is very high. And I can make both to say that technology security is to technology management what financial control is to financial management, and we'll look a little bit more into that later during this review session, this seminar. So to summarize, businesses are set up to manage uncertainties, to create a sense of certainties. Therefore, strategic risk management is quite important capability to be able to generate value. Technology drives the business. Therefore, managing technology risk is a primary requirement for a business going concern. And technology security is as important to technology management as financial control is to financial management. If all of those are agreeable, then I can say that the maturity of a business general controls environment will determine and drive its capacity to generate and sustain business value. So my argument this evening, security can enable strategic value. Security can become strategic topic in the boardroom, and security can optimize delivery. So why is this very important? Of course, we want to generate positive engagement with a purpose across the organization, across the enterprise. It is very, very important for us to be able to do that. We want to be able to avoid blind spots in our environment, and as organizations out there who have not been able to identify a blind spot, what's happened to them, we want to improve investment in security, in technology management. We want to be able to, for every dollar that we spend, be able to generate the maximum value possible. Also want to be able to improve assurance levels, and we want to become strategic enablers to organizations. Now, this evening is going to be a game of two halves. The first half is a little bit like this, more graphical, color coded, things that we know about. The second half is going to be a little bit more engineering of risk and uncertainties. It's going to look more like this, but look, I'm going to walk us through it. Let's get on the way. Businesses are risky ventures, but at the end of the day, we want to create stakeholder values. The stakeholders define what value is to the organization, and the stakeholders will look to minimize the cost of creating or generating those values in order to maximize the value accruing to them. So, we need to be able to help stakeholders generate and produce what they determine to be valuable, and of course minimize the cost of doing that. If we can do this, we will be strategic to the business. The businesses need security to help prevent value erosion. So it's a good thing that the business generates, value, but if the value is lost as soon as it is generated, then at the end of the day, the bottom line is going to be minimized. Now, if technology drives businesses, technology will look to us as professionals to ensure that technology does not drain the business. So, the business looks to us to help minimize value erosion. And if we are able to help the business to actually generate those values and protect values created at the least possible cost, guess what? We are strategic enablers. We become very, very strategic to the business. So at the end of the day, optimize risk, enable value delivery at the stretch, drive value delivery, all at the minimum possible cost to the business. Now, before we go on, let's actually find out what is valuable to the business and put some things in context. What's on the screen then, and I won't read everything because we're going to get the slide, the detailed slide. Some of the things that are valuable to the business strategy. You see, work, value creation and delivery, credibility, being reputable, legal compliance, insurability and survivability, and of course, to users, we want access to usable and friendly and enabling technologies. We want to be sure that we can interact with our technology environment in a way that makes life relatively easy, albeit secure. Now, what kind of things do we do on day-to-day basis? I was drawing some pictures, but then our friend Henry Yang published this lovely picture on LinkedIn. I reached out to him and I've been granted the right to be able to reuse his content, but all credit to Henry. This is a very lovely picture of some of the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, some of the context to the professionalism and to our skill set. It is mind-boggling a lot. However, the important thing is what drives and motivates the activities that we perform on a day-to-day basis. That is the primary question that we need to ask ourselves. And at the end of the day, we want to shift the risk dial in the positive direction. We want to help the business to manage risk effectively so that the business can generate and maintain value accruing to stakeholders. And of course, stakeholders in this context includes Directors, shareholders, customers, regulatory environment, employees, everybody with an interest in the organization. Now, to be able to do that, of course, we need to manage risk. We need to do the foundation, the basics very well. We need to remediate vulnerabilities in the environment. We need to secure by design. We need to secure through delivery. These are foundational stuff that if we don't do them well, we aren't going anywhere. Of course, in addition to all of this, we also need to be able to operate securely. So it's well and good that we remediate current exposures. We design and deliver new solutions securely, but we need to operate securely. We also then need to be able to govern security environment, technology environment, and ensure that we align value with the organization. There's no point we doing all of these things here, motion, but we are not in alignment, not moving the business forward. And of course, we need to ensure that we maintain a growth mindset, that we are open to new ideas, that we measure and manage our activities, that we continue to learn and improve. Yes, we do all of these things very well. Another question then pops up. How much do we invest and by when do we make those investments? Critical questions. And those questions, the SVRE can help us answer. Now, before we go on and begin to ask the question, is this actually real? In a minute, I'm going to demonstrate or show you a framework that I've used in the past and we've deployed here at Mercury and deployed in some other organizations. So the framework does work. It is not just theoretical. Of course, we are driving what we do on a daily basis with concrete science and engineering facts and principles. So the model does work. Now, on the screen is a model that we have deployed, taking into account or into consideration all the things that I will be discussing with you this evening. Everything that we do at Mercury is moderated via the lens of risk management. We try not to implement anything that is not addressing a risk position. Remember, at the end of the day, we want to be able to shift the dial in the right direction. So everything that we do must drive and optimize our risk posture. It is all about managing risk, enabling the business to handle its risk dynamics effectively. Now let's move forward. All the standards that we subscribe to, ISO 27001 and through to 19, the entire series, the NZISN, the voluntary control security standard for control system operation, the PSR, that's protective security, the ISO, all the standards, including the NIST that we subscribe to, are all founded upon risk management. Everything, in fact, says based on risk management, on risk assessment, controls should be implemented. Therefore, this is very, very important. And of course, it's all about risk optimization, because we know that the more controls we deploy in an environment, the higher the cost that we carry and the cost to operate, because controls do cost money. But the more control we implement, the lower the risk profile. Now, remembering that the business is set out to generate and create value, we cannot just keep pumping money into controls. There must be a midpoint, a point of equilibrium. And the board of directors have defined that. They've defined what's acceptable, called the risk appetite. Of course, there will be risk tolerance around the appetite, and we will see how to manage those. So let's just look at this 6x6 risk matrix, from significant risk to extreme risk, from something that is rare, something that's almost. Now, the board of directors have defined appetite, safe, compliance, risk at a low level. Say we assess a risk and it is a bit high in the red zone, we need to move it, of course, towards appetite. Now, there are multiple options of doing that. You have a direct route that will cost, say, $10, and you have some other route that will cost 11, various costs, 20, 50, 100. Now, here I'm not just talking about dollar value, but you also need to look into the political currency, emotional turmoil, instability that this may cause in the environment. Our choice as professionals should look for the path that will cause the least challenge, that cause the least for our environment. That is our option. Now let's take a look at another option, another risk, defined as medium appetite, but assessed as high. Now, it may be possible that the direct path will cost more emotionally, politically, and maybe in dollar values. Meanwhile, there is a series of paths of elements that we can take that would drive us towards appetite, but in phases. If the time is acceptable and the cost is lower than is the least or the optimized path, then I will suggest and recommend that is the path we must take. So it is not required that we go through the direct path at all times. We need to consider the cost of equilibrium. Now, the overall construct, mathematically defining that concept, is this: risk profile is the sum of individual risks that we carry. Of course, your threat, exploiting a vulnerability, less the general controls in the environment. And I'm sure many of us are already used to this. Shortly, we'll see that really has some limitations. However, if that is all we can do, it does provide us a number of insights into what we can do. Number one, I must call out that threat landscape is outside of our controls. Those are things that happen outside of our immediate circle of influence. Nobody, no professional in his right mind will go and create a virus to infect an organization. Those happen in the hackerland. But what we can do, though, we can monitor for these threats emergence. We can look for indicators. We can assess our vulnerabilities. We can assess and benchmark our general controls environment for maturity. And when we do notice something a little bit out of the ordinary happen, implement supplementary controls, of course, through the lens of risk management, and ensure. Now, the static view of risk, given by the last equation that we saw, risk being given by threats exploiting a vulnerability. When we less our current controls environment, from that we have our current risk, and the summation of that gives us the risk profile of the environment. Now, that really is a very static view of risk. Businesses come into existence knowing what risk they need to manage. Now, the risk at the point of coming into existence does change. And In fact, risk change from day to day. I even bet every minute, depending on the very dynamic nature of our environment, of what is happening across the globe. Therefore, just limiting ourselves to the static view of risk is limiting the levers that we can manage to enable the business to create value. The landscape is an active, path dependent dynamic system with many moving parts. And in fact, two organizations could have the same elements, could operate in the same environment, but because of the interactions of the individuals or the organizational structure, would actually be carrying different level of risk. And that's why it is a bit dangerous to conclude that because a similar organization in the same industry has managed risk in a particular way, therefore we must adopt that same risk management construct. Of course, looking at what our colleagues and peers are doing can, in actual fact, inspire the way we manage risk for our environment. But we cannot take their experience as a template and apply it to our environment verbatim. It is quite dangerous. Can we not do anything about threat at all? Yes, it is. Threats happen outside of our environment, but in actual fact, looking at the dynamic nature of threats, our monitoring signals and intelligence, there are things that we may be able to do to put our organizations in a much better standing position, to be able to continue to enable our businesses to thrive even in the presence of multitudes of threats. And if we understand this, it may actually be the difference between survival when things are rough and going under. Now, also, I'm not sure about people in the other, in the gallery. Maybe you have open check in your organizations to be able to spend, anything at all you want on security. But certainly, most of organizations I relate with and currently I'm part of, the funding is limited. We strive to get funding for everything that we do. Of course, we have our board support, but the pulse is not bottomless. Now, the question is, where do we spend those hard fought for dollars? Where do we invest? And how do we invest? How do we ensure that every dollar we spend creates the maximum value for our organization? Now, these are the things that we are going to look at in this second half of our conversation this evening. Let's go on. Me.
Yes, now we can hear.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Thanks, Oli. So, how do we know where to invest our hard earned dollar? How do we sustainably shift the dial in the right direction? Sustainably, not yo. And what can we learn from other mature disciplines across the globe? Now, those two equations up there are the strategic value risk equation. And I should have said something earlier on. but of course I can blame the mic now. Chris is going to send you a very detailed PDF version of this presentation that contains the notes and some references to what we are discussing this afternoon or this evening. So those two equations there are the SVRE, and we are going to dissect the components of those equations, and we'll see the insight that we can draw from them. What is really important in our environment is the dynamics, the movements of risk posture in our environment. The business is set out to manage risk, and at times we know the risk that we are assuming in going into business, but that risk is not static. It does change. And it is the movement or the change in that risk that really can get us into trouble if not well managed. So change in risk is a function of three things. Number one, vulnerability sensitivity in the environment. Number two, the threat response agility. And number three, our general controls and maturity uplift. And I've put from the SVRE, the component that actually describe each one of these. Now, let's get back to the story I started from. Why was Peter successful in acquiring, in being able to get finance, and Freddie was not successful? Of course, the credit score. Peter's credit score was beautiful. Freddie's credit score was not so beautiful. Peter had a handle on paying his bills on time. I mean, they both handled about the same thing. But Freddie was a little bit, relaxed about paying bills. I mean, he had the money, but he was just a little bit relaxed about paying the bills. He will be chased, he will be called, and then he will pay the bill. That impacted his credit score. And Peter was able to secure the loan to get a property, but Freddie did not, even though the deposit was there. Now, what does that really mean for us in security and technology risk management field? The vulnerability that we introduce into our environment could lead to a number of things. Now, if you look at that equation there, and pardon me, we'll just talk a little bit about that equation. So that is threat T, the threat matrix, and the V there is change in vulnerability in our environment. We don't have control over threat agents outside of our organization, but we can limit the impact of threats to our organization. And how can we do that? If, for instance, we use the common vulnerability, the CVSS, the common vulnerability scoring system, to set a particular threshold of this is the maximum CVSS score that we can introduce into our environment. Say CVSS 5 is what we set for our environment. And we also introduce secure by design concept and secure through delivery. Naturally, when we're introducing new solutions, we bring in new technologies that have, say, CVSS 5. We will naturally implement controls that will compensate for that CVSS. Either do a patch or ring-fence that solution. And then from that point onward, we monitor the change in vulnerability to that particular solution. And of course, we respond, and we'll come to that. If we are able to ensure that change in vulnerability is zero, What that means is that 0 times any times 1 million is 0, nil. So what that means is that the impact of threat to our environment will be minimized. So we need to ensure that we have a vulnerability score threshold that we manage the environment to and monitor deviation from that setting. Let's go to the next component. And everything is going to hang in together very soon. Threat response agility. If we manage the environment to specific threat vulnerability threshold, and then we monitor for threats, emerging threats, and we are able to ensure that we respond to specific threats as they emerge. And I'll give you an example. When the DDoS attack across New Zealand happened, some organizations were able to respond to that specific by investing, say, 30K. Now, if we do not have a managed vulnerability setting and a number of technology components or landscape will fall foul of DDoS, the amount of money we will need to invest to stay afloat as a going concern will be very, very high. At Mercury, we were able to respond specifically to DDoS and at a particular component of our environment. The objective is to be able to respond just in time to a specific emerging threat. And of course, our general controls environment. If we avoid point control solutions, ensure that every supplementary control that we implement goes into improving our general controls environment, then we will achieve investment efficiencies far higher than just throwing dollars everywhere. And that is where we want to go to. Now, if we go back just a little bit to the component equation that we change in risk dynamics has 3 components: vulnerability sensitivity, threat response agility, and general controls. Now, if we were able to make that first component 0, because the change in the vulnerability in our environment minimized, and we were also able to fine-tune our investment in response to specific threats, emerging threats in our environment. That means, basically, that those 2 components there become 0. Because that is 0, this is emerging threats, and we're able to just spend enough to respond to that threat. Largely, those components there become 0. And the change in risk in our environment essentially becomes that. Of course, it is the inverse. And this perhaps will make sense. If your general controls environment matures, you expect that your residual risk will go down. And that is why you have the negative sign there. So the maturity of the general controls environment means that we are reducing our risk profile. And that is the optimized risk position for our organizations. Now, we've talked about risk dials. what are the metrics that we need to be measuring to be able to achieve these objectives? Of course, we want to minimize the risk profile, which is the total sum of risk that we are carrying in delivering business value. Yeah.
Okay, my question is, when you implement controls, so you have to say you have two options, one A and B. So you have to really understand what is A, what is B, and its maturity, and then select what is the best control. Am I correct?
So, so Nali's question was, in implementing controls in our environment, we really need to understand the attributes of those controls, the efficiency of the controls, the design, the operational efficiency and the design efficiency of those controls, and then be able to determine which one we'll go for. Yes, of course, and we also need to understand the cost of each of the controls. Now, cost not just in terms of dollar, although that is very, very important, but also the political capital that we are spending and the emotional turmoil, the stress is going to introduce into our environment. There are times a control will cost $11 and another one will cost $10. But to go down the path of $10 will you $10 worth of political will or capital. Meanwhile, to go down the path of $11 will cost you 50 cents of political capital. Which one would you go for? Total cost is 11.50. I'll go for that. So the cost is very, very important. So at the end of the day, we want to work with people. Of course, there are times you have to incur some political cost to be able to do the right things. Now, thank you very much, Nalin, for that question. Now, what are the metrics that we want to measure to be able to at least move in the right direction? Risk profile is very, very important. That is the total volume of risk, number of risks that we are carrying by the organization. And a very nice, neat way of quantitative method of measuring that is the mean deviation of risk to risk appetite. So the board of directors have defined risk appetite. There's a position for that. Of course, we may not get to that risk appetite every time. It is just not practical because we are a human organization. But the mean deviation, the sum of the mean deviation is very, very important. Now, risk posture. This is a measure of our resilience. We want to find the equilibrium point. Change in maturity of general controls environment is a very good proxy for measuring our risk posture. Risk agility is a very, very important one. It is one of the most difficult to achieve in a maturing organization because we want to implement controls. We want the environment to be secure. At the same time, we want the environment to be able to leverage the things that we do to go to market very quickly, to respond to changing dynamics in the market space. Now, the way to measure that is for every dollar invested in controls, what is the relative improvement in business value? And of course, the control optimization efficiency. How many controls are we reusing? Do we have to create new controls each time we discover new vulnerabilities or new threats? So those are very, very important metrics that we need to measure. Any questions?
Are you saying that we're prepared to sustain or entertain an event that might cost us $2 million in losses. So how do you land on that position of how to define monetarily the risk appetite?
Thank you, and thank you very much. So how do we quantify the risk appetite position to be able to do a cost-benefit analysis of the controls that we are about to implement? Now, one of the good things about the board of directors is that they have defined what the appetite should be for the class of risk. Say, for instance, operational risk. In our environment, the board of directors have said, look, we would only tolerate moderate operational risk. P4 in our environment is next to low. Now, if we assess a risk, and I'll probably speak very briefly about our assessment methods. Assess a risk as a P2, which is relatively high, then we know there's a gap that we need to close. Now, in our environment, we use at times quantitative assessment. We've gone through FAIR, which is a quantitative approach. We have a table that defines in monetary terms, that defines if this event is likely to cause a loss to a single individual, this is what it translates to. If it is likely to happen, say once in 10 years, this is what it means. So there are times you use methods, and we have to be aligned with the enterprise risk management framework just to be sure that we are speaking the same language. Yeah.
The assumption is also that, if I may, the assumption would also be that we have a seat at the table, though. So, yes, the business might say we're only going to tolerate X amount, but without really understanding what the IT implications are and the security requirements are in order to then eventually deliver that value. So it would be good to have a consistent seat at the table.
And yes, so you see, of course, people actually, reacted to that seat at the table. Yes, we need a seat at the table. We need a sponsor at the table. We need a sponsor at the table. In many organizations these days, security is still seen as just technology alone, right? It's just low-level technology. The more we get into these disciplines and we are seen as enabling the business, the more the profile of technology risk management and security is raised. And I believe I can speak to, Richard, if you don't mind me, citing you as an example. I worked with Richard a few years ago in an organization. Security at that stage was still seen as, low thing, but Richard has been able to elevate the discussion to the board level. Very good example in the industry. So yes, we do need a seat at the table. Richard, would you like to probably, say a few words around how you, manage to elevate security in your organization? Oh, no. I'm looking at Jim. I thought it was Richard. Oh, no. They look so alike. Okay. Now I can see him properly. Very good question. Now, those at times can be modeled as threats to our environment. And there are things that are beyond our control. Some we can influence. And if we can influence them, then we'll do our very best to influence the outcomes. But anything outside of our organization usually is seen as, threats. Oh, yeah. So qualitative is also very important. And you have to be able to, you can apply methods like the Delphi method to convert the qualitative into quantitative attributes. But you need to be consistent with the application of the methodology. Otherwise, the yardstick will be changing every time you do the assessment. But that's a threat. Mike, where's the second mic? Very good discussion. And to be honest, right, so I think we need to continue this discussion. I would like to hear, feedback from the wider team, because the more feedback we get, the more we can improve this concept. And hopefully, the general outcome for all of us is elevation of our profession in the industry. Now, I'm hoping we've been able to answer the question of how much and when to invest dollar in supplementary controls in our environment. So to my mind, the unifying strategy that combines corporate strategy, that combine with security management and strategy with our day-to-day operations is something like the SVRE. And that is the equation. And I'm going to talk through a few things. So you have risk profile, which the organization is really, really keen to hear about. The board of directors are really keen to hear about that. So you have your governance processes, you have your risk assessment methods, you have your risk monitoring and registration. Now that component there is your vulnerability management. And the other component there is your threat management and your threat intelligence, which are things that we all do on a daily basis. And your controls management, which is where you get your controls efficiency from. And of course, your general controls framework, your security operation and your sec DevOps, and your security program of work. So that is where you define your portfolio, your roadmap of activities to implement in your environment. And it's a typical CISO function. You get into an environment, you do a benchmark on an assessment, you understand what the gaps are, you define controls or initiatives that will take you to your target states, of course approved by the board, and on an ongoing basis, you monitor the threat environment to define supplementary controls. That is the unifying equation or construct that can enable us to be effective in our organizations. We've seen this before. So, remediating the environment, secure by design, secure through delivery, and
operating securely, governing and aligning value with continuous improvement gives you the SVRE. You may not be doing it quantitatively or in an analytical method as we have just gone through, but if you are able to do all of those things in an adaptive, agile way, you will be delivering the tenet and the construct of the SVRE, and that will enable you to move the dial in the right direction. Now you see the full picture, the additional things that the SVRE brings to us. For instance, around here, now we know that we need to set a maximum acceptable inherent vulnerability for our environment. If we set the CVSS to 5, we need to ensure that we maintain 5. And that was why Freddie could not get a loan, because his credit score was beneath a set limit. The financial management, the finance industry, they've got it right. Of course, it doesn't mean that that setting cannot change. Depending on the objectives of the organization, that setting can change. But once it is set at a particular threshold, we need to manage to that threshold. Of course, the corresponding governance processes around that will then begin to measure the vulnerability exposure change report needs to be generated, or new vulnerabilities that are onboarded that are above that threshold. Anything that you cannot measure, you cannot manage. And on the threat side, we need to track threat trigger threshold. If, for instance, using the MITRE framework, we have set the trigger threshold to a particular limit, anything that goes above that, we need to track. Are we missing threat response opportunities? Opportunity for investment in security. The very last complex equation. Now, yes, we've kind of gone through change in risk environment is what really matters, not the static view, but the change. However, the rate of change is also very important. If things are changing, how fast are they changing? And what does it mean for our environment? Rate of change in risk has 3 components. You have the rate of change in threat response, agility, you have control maturity, improvement rate, and you have what I call the sinkhole, which we must try to avoid. And again, the vulnerability setting comes in. If we don't manage the vulnerability threshold, that really is what will send us into a sinkhole. And we'll continue to invest money into security architecture, and we'll find that we go nowhere. So if there's a core message that I'm trying to pass across this evening, is we need to set a vulnerability threshold. What is acceptable to our environment? And manage the introduction of new technologies based around that threshold. If we don't, down the line, we'll discover that we are spending money, investing dollars, yet we are going nowhere. That is very, very important. Any questions so far?
The equation looked very complicated, but now that you've given us the keys, good.
Thank you. And Chris will be sending out a PDF version of this presentation that has the rigor, the notes, and some references. I deliberately try not to go into path integral, which of course it's quite important, but you will find them in that note. Now that we have gone through this, am I able to say that security can enable strategic value? Yes, thank you. Am I able to say that security can become strategic topic in our boardrooms? I'm sure the board of directors of the Reserve Bank are talking about security now. Am I able to say that security can become operational discussion points across the enterprise? If we do all of these things, hopefully for our organizations, we'll be moving the dial in the right direction. And yes, I sincerely submit to you that the maturity of the general controls environment in any organization would determine their capability to be able to effectively manage risk and create value for their stakeholders. And there I rest my case, QED. Questions and answers, please. Thank you.